non-aggressive. What we want to do is we don't want to go and attack someone about things in the past or what they've said in the past. We want to go and just communicate with them with about what challenges that we're facing, what our fears are, what our hopes are as far as what we can do in the future. And that video, I mean, I'm looking at it too, and it's just so powerful. It's someone communicating clearly what they're going through. And I mean, I think it's so powerful too, is because he's pleading with him versus what we see sometimes in Washington, where I still love the activism. I still love the compassion that these people are having as far as some of the protests outside the offices. But that sometimes puts up a wall. And what we want to do is kind of break down that wall. We want to have an open communication with the person sitting across from us. And I think actually a really good example of this, and Peter will agree with this also, is Darrell Issa's office. Yeah. And days before we were going there, I was kind of telling Peter, I'm like, I hope we can actually get into this office because there are so many protesters outside of it. Mm-hmm. And we must have been there on a quiet day because there was nobody in the hallway. And I believe it was his chief of staff, Peter, or his healthcare policy person, but I do think it was his chief of staff. We sat down and we were getting non-confrontational about the conversation that we were having. And it ends up that he is also a veteran that served in Iraq at the same time I did. And rather than kind of going toe to toe and having an argument in regards to Darrell Issa's policies or his views in regards to healthcare, I tried to find common ground with him and kind of talk about something that we both can agree on, but we really didn't plan on talking about when we went there, and that was homelessness with veterans. But knowing that the conversation would still lead to mental health issues with veterans if I kind of opened up that door. And through that conversation, I understood I don't want to kind of reveal too much because it was a personal story that he had, but we found that he's dealing with the same things as in regards to one of his friends. Mm-hmm. And so, again, we were able to have a very open and very, I think, productive conversation with him as far as kind of breaking down those walls. And it's a lot easier for Peter and I to go and do that because we don't represent a party. Obviously, we're both progressive and leaning on the Democratic side. But again, I'm not a Democrat sitting in office. And what actually ends up happening is we end up playing a game of telephone where a Republican office will go and give us information to go and give to the Democrats and vice versa in order to open up that communication between them.
That's just amazing. You'd think they could talk to each other.
Yeah, you would think, right? We end up being, like Rev was saying, we end up being the conduit. I mean, we were in Tammy Duckworth's office. Yeah, and you know, I've been focusing a lot, you know, like a lot of times we'll, you know, visit offices that, you know, have from constituents that have shared their stories with us, but then a lot of times I'll specifically, you know, hit up the people on the health committee of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, the Senate, that, you know, make a lot of these healthcare decisions. And, you know, I've been very, you know, close with Senator Alexander's office, and hearing from Tammy Duckworth's office that they don't hear from Alexander's office and hear from any of the Republicans on the health committee, that was a concern of theirs. Again, like Rev was saying, it's like a game of telephone. It's like, but we're the conduits for them, and there's only like 100 senators, and you think that they would talk to each other, at least in the hall, and God knows that their office is like maybe like 50 feet from each other. So it is kind of, you know, when you think about it, it's, I mean, hopefully we go down there and we encourage them to speak, you know, the conversation we had with, you know, Senator Alexander's office after we give them the feedback from Senator Duckworth's office, that hopefully we encourage that communication, that conversation. You know, that's all we can hope for, and at least we can share that information. But yeah, it was very, very eye-opening. I had actually never heard that before in any of my previous trips.
Well, and there was something similar on your Periscope video that you did with Representative Maloney. You had been in to see Speaker Ryan's office, and
Oh yeah.
she was
Oh
like, "Oh, it's hard to
yeah.
get in there, but you got in there." So that's kind of
Yeah.
amazing that one of his fellow representatives thinks of it as a difficult place to get to, but you're able to
Mm,
manage to do that.
yeah, that was quite yeah. That was kind of like I never expected that to happen. To be quite honest with you, honestly, I just never. But I was grateful. It's like you got nothing to lose if you ask for an appointment, and worst they could say is no. And there were people that I thought that would never say no, and they have, and I don't really want to bring them up, but and we're talking some Democrat offices. So you have to, I think, when you advocate, you have to be really open to everyone, and you know, sometimes you sometimes like, I mean, definitely on the Republican side. I mean, I think we both go in there. We don't expect to change any minds. A lot of times it is investigative, but there's some surprises, like Senator Grassley's office, right? Red, would you say that was like a very nice surprise as well? I mean, his healthcare policy person is actually a doctor, and she's probably like the longest like healthcare policy person in the Senate. She's been there for like probably at least 30 years. Very smart woman who's a doctor, and she surprised us, and it was probably the most engaging conversation that we had with I would think with any of the I mean, in my opinion, other than the ISA representative, I think that we had when we were down there.
Yeah. And what you discover too is that, and Peter and I are guilty of it just like everybody else is, you go in with preconceived notions of people. And I'm sure people have preconceived notions of ourselves before we walk in the door. And specifically that appointment. It was funny when we first kind of, shake hands and you introduce yourself. We thought that was going to be the case. And then as soon as we just started talking and having just a normal conversation, one person to another, that instantly broke down. And I don't know if Peter had the same feeling I was. It's with her being specifically a doctor also, we're kind of looking across the table at a doctor, someone that we're all very familiar with, just with the challenges that we face with our disabilities. And it became a different conversation completely. And what we found is we have these sweeping generalizations as far as, the Republicans completely want the ACA gone versus, the Democrats that are completely for it. And there's nuances in there where one specific senator or one specific representative may have an issue with one piece of the legislation versus another. And it's kind of finding those pieces to the puzzle and figuring out which way you can go and bridge those gaps by having those conversations. So I think one point that she really stressed to us was the pre-existing condition piece. She was really upset as far as that piece being kind of thrown into the bill. And again, talking to us, it might be a little bit easier conversation knowing that we do have pre-existing conditions. But you think to yourself, why can't they do this themselves? They shouldn't have to have us having these conversations. But again, I think just how Washington is, it's become so toxic where it's all or nothing, where there's no middle ground or kind of conversations happening, or they're not allowing enough time for us or for themselves to have these conversations, where normal kind of business in Washington would be having hearings, would be discussing these issues over the matter of months versus trying to pass bills or legislation over the matter of days. And I think that was actually one topic that we talked specifically to her about is there just isn't regular order right now in Washington versus what we may have seen, heck, even a year ago. And that's where Peter and I try to come in. If they can't have hearings, at least they can talk to two people. And I think the really kind of encouraging thing that I found, this happened on the second day, we started recognizing people in the hallways.
Mm.
Obviously, there's lobbyists doing, I don't want to say the opposite of us, but definitely with their own agendas. But what we started doing is we started recognizing normal citizens that were going from office to office, doing the same exact thing that we are. And it kind of encouraged me a lot, knowing that Peter and I are not alone. There's other citizens that are doing the same exact thing. And if Peter and I can do it, if they can do it, it doesn't even have to be healthcare. It could be any topic that you're passionate about. And I encourage you to go and find the topic that you're most passionate about and then have those discussions. We were talking about with children with healthcare or even gun safety. We were talking to 2 victims of gun violence, again, doing the same exact thing that we were. I think that's kind of our role as citizens, is to have our voices heard and to talk to our representatives about the issues that affect us the most.
Yeah, that's something similar to what we heard from a representative from Moms Demand Action who was on a recent episode saying, that's kind of the role of Moms Demand Action, is just to make sure that the voices of those who want to have gun safety and common sense gun laws are just as loud as the voices, if not louder than the voices coming from the NRA and other entities like that. So I think that's really useful for everyone to hear kind of over and over again, is that we need to be vocal. We need to be out there.
And be vocal with a purpose.
Yeah.
I think that's the biggest thing that we kept on hearing as far as feedback goes. And again, I love the fact that everyone goes and reaches out. And it doesn't have to be complex as far as what you're saying,
Right.
but make sure that you're saying something that's personal. I know that sometimes people use kind of like automatic services to go and make a lot of phone calls very, very quickly. And one thing that I didn't realize going in there, I always assumed that those were great tools. The offices have found out when those calls come in, and they kind of glaze over them a little bit versus someone who comes in and says, you know what, my son has a disability, or my family member was a victim of gun violence, or if this tax bill goes through, I may lose my house because I don't have enough money at the end of the day. All of those stories make a difference versus, hey, vote no on this bill, or yes, vote yes on this bill. So I encourage people just to take that extra step versus just a yes or no kind of conversation. Explain why. And all of us, it's very easy to go and find a reason why for a lot of these bills. And I think that's where kind of the power that Peter and I are trying to give back to people and just showing people, hey, this is what we can do. For Peter, it's physically exhausting. I don't know how he does it. I'm physically healthy, and I was completely drained at the end of this. But for myself, suffering from PTSD, it's really difficult for me to be away from my house with the symptoms of like agoraphobia for 2 days without contact with my family or not being kind of close to my comfort zone. It really does help having a best friend with me as far as Peter is concerned and knowing my condition is. But if Peter and I can do it, anybody can do it.
Thank you for saying that. That's very nice of you. I don't want to just glaze over that either. The other thing is, and people ask me this all the time, I live in a blue state. Does my voice count? Does my call even matter? And I mean, we were told over and over again, absolutely. I mean, it's, and I've heard this many, many times, the volume of calls matter. And, of course it matters in a red state. And it matters just as much. Your calls, your emails, they really make the determination, because, you're their constituent and you're their voice, and that's who they're going to listen to ultimately, because it's going to determine whether they're going to be reelected or not. And it is so crucial. And what's also important, too, is if you do know anyone, if you are in a blue state, you should make that call. And if you know anyone, like for instance, right now, Susan Collins is a big deciding factor, and Jeff Flake as well, in this tax bill that could, change their votes. So if you know anyone in Maine, or if you know anyone in Arizona, you should be speaking to them to make sure that they're calling every day, because that is really crucial as well. And it's a little